The morning Aunt Grace died, I was knee-deep in damp soil, planting the antique marigolds she'd gifted me for my 30th birthday. My phone buzzed 3 times before I finally yanked off my gardening gloves and answered. "Miss Carter?" said a formal voice I didn't recognize. "This is Henry Langford, your Aunt Grace's attorney. I'm afraid I have some difficult news." My chest tightened. The marigolds suddenly felt heavy in my hands. Grace's last gift to me. What happened?" I asked. "She passed peacefully in her sleep last night," he replied, then a pause. "She left strict instructions that I contact you before anyone else in the family." I sank to my knees in the soil, barely able to process his words. Aunt Grace, the woman who taught me how to draw, who snuck me lemon drops during boring reunions, who cheered me on when no one else did, was gone. "Miss Carter? Are you still there?" "Yes," I managed, my voice thin. "I'm here. What do I need to do?" "She left detailed instructions regarding her funeral," he continued. "And," another pause, "she wrote you a letter. It must be opened before the service." "Can I come to your office today?" I asked. I looked down at the marigolds. Golden sunburst, her favorite. Just 2 weeks ago she'd placed them in my hands with that familiar twinkle in her eye. "These flowers have been in our family for generations," she'd told me. Like secrets. At the time I'd thought it was just one of her usual quirky sayings. Now I wasn't so sure. "I'll be there in an hour," I said. Henry Langford's office was exactly what you'd expect from a man who managed old estates. Dark mahogany furniture, shelves lined with law books, and a sweeping view of downtown Boston. He rose as I entered, offering a somber smile. "Miss Carter, thank you for coming so quickly. Please, have a seat." I sat down in one of the heavy leather chairs, trying not to feel overwhelmed. "Mr. Langford," I asked, "why did Aunt Grace want you to call me first?" He opened a drawer and took out 2 envelopes. One thick, formal, stamped with the firm's crest. The other was small and ivory, my name written in Grace's graceful script. "Your aunt was a remarkable woman," Langford said, choosing his words carefully. "A brilliant mind, but also very particular. She left extremely specific instructions regarding her will and the funeral." "That sounds like her," I murmured. He slid the smaller envelope toward me. "She asked that you read this alone, then we can go over the rest." My fingers shook slightly as I picked it up. Her scent jasmine and old books still clung to the paper. I carefully opened the flap and pulled out a single sheet from her personalized stationery. "My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, my time is finally up. Don't be sad. I lived the exact life I wanted, which is more than most can say, but I have one last favor to ask of you, my beloved niece. At my funeral you'll need to read a letter, one that will change our family forever. You'll find it in the secret compartment of my jewelry box, the one I showed you when you were 12. Remember the trick with the sunflower carving? Some might call this revenge, but I prefer to call it justice. Long delayed, maybe, but justice all the same. The truth is, I've left everything to you. Blackridge Enterprises, my assets, all of it. But there's one condition. You must read that letter at my funeral, with every family member present. No exception." "I know this is a lot to ask, especially now," the letter continued, "but you've always been the strong one, Clara, the honest one. That's why it has to be you. All my love. Aunt Grace. P.S. Don't let them bury me in anything beige. You know how I feel about beige." I read it twice, slowly, then again just to make sure I hadn't misread what she was really asking. "She left everything to me," I said quietly, lifting my eyes to Langford. He nodded solemnly and opened the thick envelope bearing the law firm's crest. "Blackridge Enterprises." Her personal estate, investment portfolios, properties, total assets valued at approximately $89 million. I swallowed hard. Grace had always been generous, but this was beyond anything I could have imagined. "But what about my father? My cousin?" "There are some minor bequests, sentimental items. Modest sums," Langford said, glancing at the documents. "But the majority is yours. Assuming you fulfill her final request." My thoughts spiraled. I thought of my father, who'd spent most of my life grumbling about his older sister's success. Of my cousins who'd practically lined up to flatter Grace during every holiday visit, hoping they'd be named in her will. And of Grace herself, always quiet at those gatherings, watching her sharp gaze flickering with something unspoken. "When is the funeral?" I asked. 3 days from now," he replied. Your aunt left detailed instructions. The service will be held at St. Andrew's Chapel, followed by a reception at the estate. The entire family is expected to attend. I stood gripping Grace's letter tightly. Then I'd better go, I said. I have a jewelry box to find. As I reached the door, Langford called after me, his voice more gentle this time. Miss Carter, one more thing. Your aunt asked me to tell you something. I turned. She said Clara will know what to do with the truth. My thoughts wouldn't stop racing. What was in the second letter? What secret could be so heavy that Grace would make it a condition of her will? The gates opened as I approached. Grace had given me the code years ago, saying she trusted me more than any alarm system. The house hadn't changed. A sprawling Victorian nestled among topiary hedges and flowering vines, with marigolds and roses climbing up the trellises like they were reaching for the past. Mrs. Hampton, the housekeeper, met me at the door. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her voice trembled as she said, "Oh, Miss Clara, I'm so glad you're here. She left word," she continued, "that you were to have full access to her room." "Thank you, Mrs. Hampton. I won't be long." Grace's bedroom was on the second floor, overlooking the very garden where I had planted her final gift. The room was exactly as I remembered, graceful chaos, silk curtains in wild colors, paintings of abstract cities, family photographs in hand-carved frames, and of course her signature roses. Everywhere, the jewelry box sat atop her dress, Brazilian rosewood carved with such delicate precision it almost looked alive. I ran my fingers over the familiar grooves, until I found it, the small sunflower carving, third petal from the right. I whispered. I pressed it. A faint click sounded, and the bottom panel slid open. Inside was an envelope, sealed with burgundy wax, and marked in her neat script, "To be read at my funeral." My hand trembled as I lifted it. It was heavier than I expected, and I could feel the shape of photos inside. For a moment the temptation to open it right there was overwhelming. But I knew Grace. Everything she did had purpose. If she wanted this truth revealed publicly in front of the whole family, it wasn't a whim, it was a deliberate choice. I slid the envelope into my bag and stood silently for a moment, letting my eyes drift over the room that held so many memories. On the bedside table, nestled between two books of poetry, was a photograph I had never seen before. Grace, barely in her 20s, stood smiling in front of a small office with a man I didn't recognize. They were holding what looked like blueprints, beaming with pride. "What did you know, Grace?" I whispered to the photo. What truth was too dangerous to tell? Until now. I slipped the envelope into my bag, and took one last look around the room. On the bedside table was a framed photo I'd never seen before. Grace, young and radiant, standing in front of Blackridge Enterprises' very first office. She wore that familiar knowing smile, the one that always made me feel like she could see straight through anyone's facade. "What did you know, Aunt Grace?" I whispered to the glass. What secret was worth waiting a lifetime to reveal? The next 3 days passed in a blur of logistics and barely disguised family tension. My father called me 6 times, switching between pretending to care about the funeral and probing for information about the will. My cousins bombarded me with messages, clumsy, transparent attempts to fish for updates or flatter me into sharing something. Through it all, I kept Grace's sealed envelope close. At night I'd sit in bed just holding it, trying to imagine the weight of its truth. What could be inside that mattered enough to shape her final wishes? Enough to risk unraveling everything. The morning of the funeral arrived clear and bright, as if the universe had paused to honor her. I dressed in a tailored deep blue suit, Grace's favorite color, and pinned one of her cherished marigolds to my lapel. The envelope sat heavily in my bag, as if it carried more than just paper and photos. St. Andrew's Chapel was already filled when I arrived. The Carters were old Boston money, and Grace had been a pillar of both business and charity circle. The pews overflowed with family, business partners, community leaders, and a few unfamiliar faces in elegant black. My father intercepted me at the entrance, his expression pinched with nerves. "Clara," he hissed, "we need to talk about the will. Langford won't tell us anything. Says we have to wait until after the service. What's going on?" I met his gaze steadily. "We'll all find out together, Dad. That's what Aunt Grace wanted." He grabbed my arm as I moved to pass. "If you know something, let go," I said quietly but firmly. "This is her funeral. Show some respect." The service was beautiful, exactly as she would have wanted. Not a single beige flower in sight. Every floral arrangement overflowed with marigolds, roses and vibrant wild blooms. Her favorite music played softly in the background. The minister spoke of her kindness, her sharp mind, her unwavering drive to leave the world better than she found it. Then came the moment. From the front pew, Langford met my eye and gave a subtle nod. My palms felt slick as I rose, envelope in hand, and walked to the podium. The chapel grew still. My father sat in the front row, his face drawn and pale. Beside him my cousins, Sam and Eliza, leaned forward with unsettling anticipation. I took a deep breath, the scent of roses and marigolds swirling around me, grounding. In that moment, I could almost feel Grace's presence, calm, steady, urging me on. Before she passed I began, my voice steadier than I expected. My Aunt Grace wrote a letter with very specific instructions. She asked that it be read here today, in front of everyone who knew her. I broke the wax seal, aware that every eye in the room was fixed on me. Inside were several pages, thick with ink, and what looked like old photographs. As I pulled them free, a ripple of whispers swept through the pew. The first image was of a young Grace, standing beside a man I didn't recognize, both smiling, holding what looked like architectural plans. The second showed the same man at a construction site, surrounded by what I now recognized as the early stages of Blackridge's original headquarters. My name, I read aloud, was Grace Carter, and this is the truth about how Blackridge Enterprises began. A murmur passed through the crowd. I continued, my voice even. The man in these photos is Thomas Hale, an engineer, a genius, and my business partner. In 1975, he and I founded what would eventually become Blackridge Enterprises. He was the mind, I was the strategist. Everything we built together, 50-50. Another photo, Grace and Thomas shaking hands over a contract. But on the night of October 21, the reports said it was an accident, a tragic crash. I paused. My father shifted uncomfortably, but it wasn't an accident. The brake lines on his car had been deliberately cut. Gasps echoed through the chapel. My father's face drained of color. I discovered the truth too late, after the police had already closed the case. But I also discovered something else. Forged documents, filed just hours before his death. Documents that transferred Thomas's entire share of the company to the Carter family. I looked up and met my father's eyes. Documents signed with a forged signature, forged by his business partner at the time, my own brother Charles Carter. Chaos erupted. The hush exploded into shocked exclamations, shuffling feet, and disbelief. Stop this, my father barked, standing. This is outrageous. Lies. No, Dad, I said calmly, lifting the rest of the documents. Grace kept everything: contracts, witness statements, expert analyses of the signature, financial trails. It's all here. Why? Someone cried out. It was Eliza, voice shaking. Why reveal this now? I turned back to Grace's letter, her words now etched into memory. Because I've spent my life building something good out of something stolen. I've used our success to fund education, green innovation, and support young minds. But I've also watched as my brother profited from betrayal and built a legacy on a lie. I couldn't carry it any longer. Not silently. My father sat down slowly, like the weight of 40 years had finally hit him. Grace's final confession came now. She'd found Thomas Hale's only child, his daughter Rachel. She'd supported her anonymously, funded her education, even helped her start a research company in sustainable engineering. And now she was here, a woman near the center pew, late 30s, intelligent eyes, holding herself with quiet strength. Rachel Hale, I said, Grace left you 30% of Blackridge Enterprises, as partial restitution for what was stolen from your father. The rest she had left to me. I looked up, heart pounding, and finished the letter, because Clara is the only one in the Carter family who has ever shown the integrity and courage Thomas once had. She is the future of this company, not because of blood but because of values. The chapel was silent, and then as Rachel walked forward, eyes full of unshed tears, I knew what Grace had meant. She wasn't trying to destroy, she was trying to heal. She'd waited a lifetime for the right moment, and now she'd trusted me to carry the truth. I broke the wax seal slowly, conscious of hundreds of eyes watching my every move. Inside were several sheets of paper and, as I'd suspected, photographs. As I pulled them out, I heard a strangled sound come from my father in the front pew. The first photo showed a young Aunt Grace, standing beside a man I didn't recognize. They were smiling, holding what looked like architectural blueprint. The second photo showed that same man at a construction site, standing in front of a steel framework I now realized was the early skeleton of Blackridge Enterprises' first headquarters. I cleared my throat and began to read. My name was Grace Carter, I said, my voice steady, echoing in the silent cathedral. And this is the truth about how Blackridge Enterprises began. The crowd held its breath. The man in these photographs is Thomas Hale, a brilliant engineer and my business partner, and he was also the true founder of what became Blackridge Enterprises. A murmur rippled through the congregation. In the front row, my father had gone completely white. I continued. Thomas and I met at university. We shared a vision of creating sustainable construction materials that could transform the industry. Thomas had the mind for innovation. I had the connections and business drive. Together we built the foundation of this company. I held up a third photo, Grace and Thomas shaking hands over a contract, grinning with pride. We were equal partners. Everything was 50-50, the patents, the ownership, the profits. I paused for breath, then turned the page. That all changed on October 21, 1976, the night Thomas died in what was ruled a car accident. My father began to shift in his seat, as if trying to rise, but Uncle Warren placed a firm hand on his shoulder and shook his head. But it wasn't an accident. The brake lines in Thomas's car had been cut. I found out too late. The case had already been closed. The hush in the cathedral deepened. I also discovered something else. I read documents had been filed just hours before Thomas died. Documents that transferred all of his shares in the company to the Carter Family Trust. Documents bearing his signature. I looked up, locking eyes with my father. A signature, I said, my voice unwavering, that I now know was forged by his business partner at the time, my own brother Charles Carter. Gasps, shouts, whispers, the sound of disbelief swept through the room like a wave. My father shot to his feet. His face was red with fury. Stop this immediately. This is a lie, a fabrication. No, Dad, I said calmly. It's the truth. And Aunt Grace left proof. I raised a thick bundle of documents from the envelope. Old contracts, forensic reports, financial records. She kept the original partnership agreement, the analysis proving the signature was forged, the buried police report, the trail of bank transfers. Why now? My cousin Eliza asked, her voice shaking as she turned to look at my father in disbelief. Why reveal this after all these years? I returned to the letter, flipping to the next page. Because I've spent 45 years building something worthy of the name we stole, I read. I used our success to support research, fund green innovation, and create opportunities for brilliant minds like Thomas. But I also spent 45 years watching my brother profit from a betrayal, watching him raise his children to believe that power and privilege meant protection from truth. My father sat back down, visibly shaken. The color had drained from his face. I should have come forward years ago, I read. But by the time I had gathered all the evidence, the company employed thousands. Exposing the truth would have destroyed, not just Charles, but the people who depended on Blackridge to survive. So I made a different choice. I reached into the envelope and pulled out one final item, a yellowed envelope addressed in Grace's hand. A letter for Rachel Hale, I announced. Thomas Hale's only surviving relative. A hush fell again. From the middle pews, a woman stood. She looked to be around my age, early 30s, tall, poised, with determined eyes that mirrored the man in the photos. Her gaze swept the room, landing briefly on my father before meeting mine. She didn't look surprised, only steady, like she'd been waiting her entire life for this moment without knowing it. Grace arranged for Rachel to be here, I continued. She funded her education anonymously, her research, her company. Rachel Hale is now the CEO of one of the top sustainable engineering firms in the country. I looked directly at Rachel, and today Grace bequeaths to you 30% of Blackridge Enterprises, partial restitution for what was taken from your father. Gasps again, louder now. Several people in the back stood to see more clearly. I looked down at the last page of Grace's letter, reading slowly, with emotions swelling in my chest. The remaining controlling interest goes to Clara Carter, I read. The only member of this family who has lived by the same principles that Thomas and I once shared. Let the legacy be rewritten, and this time, with honesty. The cathedral was silent. Rachel stepped forward. Her voice trembled slightly, but her words rang clear. All my life, she said, looking toward the front, I thought my father had failed, abandoned his work. I never knew what was taken from him. She turned to me. Thank you for your courage, Clara. Grace watched over me. I think she always meant for this moment to come. She did, I said softly. She couldn't let the truth die with her. The second part of my will, I read, my voice now gaining confidence, leaves a 30% share of Blackridge Enterprises to Rachel Hale, as partial restitution for what was stolen from her father. The controlling interest, I continued, goes to my niece Clara, the only member of the Carter family who has shown the same dedication to ethics and innovation that Thomas and I once shared. I looked up, the room was frozen in silence. Stunned faces everywhere. My father looked like he had aged 20 years in the span of minutes. The letter is signed, I said, pausing. Grace Carter, co-founder of Blackridge Enterprises, and keeper of its greatest shame. The silence that followed was complete. Then slowly, Rachel Hale stood and began walking toward the front of the cathedral. She stopped in front of my father, her gaze steady but trembling with emotion. All these years, she whispered, her voice cracking, I thought my father abandoned his work, that he gave. I never imagined. I stepped down from the podium. Miss Hale, I said gently, I'm so sorry for what was taken from you. She turned to me, tears glistening in her eyes. Thank you for reading that letter, for having the courage to do it. Your aunt, she was watching over me, wasn't she? I nodded. She was. In her own way, she always was, trying to make it right. The next few hours passed in a haze. The reception afterward was predictably strained. Family members split into factions, some arguing the letter should be buried, others talking about going to the police, and many too stunned to speak at all. My father disappeared before dessert was served. I didn't hear from him for weeks until I received word he had checked himself into a rehabilitation facility. For the first time in decades, he was confronting the guilt he had buried deep. In the months that followed, Grace's letter went public. The founding story of Blackridge was rewritten. There were media storms, investor meetings, and a flurry of questions. But Grace had been right. The company was strong enough to weather it. With Rachel's engineering brilliance and my stewardship of Grace's values, we started building something new. Something on. 1 year later, I stood in Grace's rose garden, now in full bloom. Rachel joined me for our weekly meeting, as she always did. We talked strategy, reviewed new sustainable initiatives, and often wandered into conversations about life, legacy, and forgiveness. She reached down to touch one of the blooming roses, Grace's treasured sunfire hybrid. You know what's strange, Rachel said. I always felt like someone was guiding me, watching over my career, nudging me in the right direction. I used to think it was my father, but now, I know it was Grace. I smiled. She protected all of us. I said, the company, the people who depended on it, you, even my father in her own way, but she couldn't let the truth die with her. Rachel looked thoughtful. Do you think she made the right choice? Waiting all those years, I considered the question. I think she did the best she could with an impossible situation. She turned something built on betrayal into a force for good. She made sure you were cared for, and in the end, she made sure the truth came out on her own terms. Rachel nodded slowly. And you, do you ever regret being the one who had to carry it? I looked out over the garden. The sun had dipped low, casting golden light across the petals. Grace's roses looked like they were glowing. No, I said softly. She chose me because she knew I could handle it. Because she knew I'd understand that sometimes, doing the right thing, means facing the hardest truths. Rachel looked toward the Blackridge building rising in the distance. She would be proud of what we've built. She's a real partnership, just like she and my father intended. I reached down and gently touched one of the blooming roses. Grace had once told me these roses had been in the family for generations, just like secrets, she'd said. But maybe now, it was time for something different. Truth instead of secrets. Partnership instead of power, building together, not taking apart. Rachel took my hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. I think both our fathers would have liked that.